The Endgame Gear KB65HE is Endgame's first foray into the keyboard space, and just on the face of it, they've clearly taken this seriously. This 65% board is heavy enough to be used as a lethal weapon or a boat anchor, and the HE part of the name is in reference to the Gateron Hall-Effect switches that it uses. This isn't just a slap together, quick, get a product out jobby. This is a legitimately premium product, and for a not so premium price tag too. There are quite a few things that I think you should know before buying one just yet, so let me explain. First, let's take a look at the board itself. This is a CNC milled aluminium chassis that is truly solid. It's actually one solid block where they've hogged out the middle, drilled out a hole for the USB-C port at the top left, and milled a few features in the bottom, namely the interchangeable rubber feet that give you the option of basically having it flat on your desk or a modest elevation. It doesn't end up getting as high as I think I would prefer, especially as it's already a fairly thick board to begin with. It's certainly manageable though, and if gaming is your primary use case, it's possibly better. It would be nice to have the option for, higher position though, or a wrist rest. Either way, the actual fit and finish here is genuinely top notch. It's easily on par with the Gateron Q1 I reviewed last year, and being a solid milled block of aluminium, it's remarkably planted and rigid. Interestingly, inside you'll find two separate silicon rubber mats, one under the board, between the board and the case, and one between the PCB and the faceplate that the switches are mounted to. This gives the board a very soft and quite muted tone. Have a listen. Personally, I really like this more understated sound. It feels very premium and makes it a lot more suitable for professional environments as well as personal, but also more sound-sensitive spaces. It feels like the opposite end of the mechanical keyboard spectrum from the ostentatiously clicky, light of 1,000 suns RGB lit boards from, say, someone like Razer or Corsair. The KB65 does have RGB lighting, and it is reasonably bright too, but it is a touch more subtle than your average gaming keyboard. Since we're talking about the typing experience, I should mention that the Gateron KS37B white switches that Endgame have opted for here feel pretty premium too. They are linear switches, meaning there's no tactile bump or click. This makes sense seeing as they're Hall-Effect switches and you can change the actuation point. It'd be a bit pointless to have a tactile bump somewhere in the middle of the travel when you've set the actuation point to the very top or bottom. Still, the mix of padding inside and the relatively light 30-gram force of pressure required to move the key feels pretty nice, both for typing and for gaming. It's worth highlighting the switches in particular, because they are both rather unique in what possibilities this style of switch can offer, and because of the specific implementation in this board. As I mentioned, these are Gateron KS37B white switches. These are Hall-Effect switches, although it's arguably a bit of a stretch to call these switches, because they don't actually switch anything. And that's not just me being pedantic, by the way, although I do like doing that. These are nothing more than a magnet embedded in the stem, a spring, and a housing. There are no electrical components here. These don't solder or clip into the PCB as a self-contained unit. These require a Hall-Effect sensor soldered to the PCB nearby to function. What surprised me about Endgame's implementation is that, as far as I can tell anyway, the IC that's on the top of the board that is very much the RGB LED, I think is also the Hall-Effect sensor? I can't find any other chips nearby that could be the Hall-Effect sensor, and as I mentioned, the switch sure doesn't have it in it, so I have to assume that the LED is also the Hall-Effect sensor. If anyone has any information on this package, or if you know that I'm wrong here, please do let me know in the comments, because I'm frankly fascinated with this design and this sort of field of electronics. Anyway, that means that these switches are hot swappable. So long as you can find a compatible replacement, you can just pop them in. That's pretty cool. The possibilities that I mentioned all revolve around the complete paradigm shift in how these switches work. See, traditional mechanical switches are pretty binary. The switch is either off or it's on. There's a bit of noise when they change states, so you have to delay the signal by a few milliseconds to actually debounce it, but otherwise, like I said, it's just on or off. Analog switches like this, if I may be a little pedantic again, aren't actually switches anymore. They're more like joysticks on a controller because there's no fixed point the switch actuates. The keyboard can keep track of exactly where every single switch is in its travel with sub-millimeter precision. Much like a joystick knows how far you've pushed it, the keyboard knows how far down a key has been pressed. That means that instead of having a singular point where the switch goes from off to on, these switches can be set to register that key press at any point that works for you. You can do different points for up and down too, and with a board like the Wooting 2 that I love so much, you can do a whole load of amazing features like use it as a proper analog controller style input in games, actually like a joystick, or even have multiple actions assigned to different press heights, so you can walk slowly when you just lightly press W, but sprint when you hold it fully down. Now on the KB65HE, Endgame have only got the up-down trigger adjustment, where either on the keyboard by pressing FN plus tab, and then using page up and page down to adjust the 20 different steps, and then press FN to exit, or via their software with 40 steps instead, you can control how far you have to, press the keys for it to register, and separately, at least on the desktop software, how high you have to lift it up before it stops registering. I'm not entirely sure why you have 20 steps on the keyboard but 40 in the desktop software, and there is at least currently a bug where if you do adjust the settings on the keyboard, which you can actually do per key as well, just press whatever keys you want, say WSD, if you want that to be a hair trigger, but everything else needs a deeper thwack, that works. Those changes don't get synced back up to the desktop app. I'd also argue that while I assume the 40 steps they have available correlate to 0.1mm steps, as the keys have about 4.1mm of total travel, framing it as a more arbitrary number, just anything from 1 to 40, is less intuitive. I prefer this to read as 0.1mm steps, so 10 would read as 1mm. It's a little easier to understand what you're adjusting and visualize what might work best for you. That way, you can also set it to whatever measurement you were already comfortable with from an older board, and then try adjusting from there to see if a different value actually suits you better. That's literally just the UI change as well. You don't need to change any of the back end, but I think it would go a long way to making this a better experience. I do also hope that Endgame puts the effort into adding some of those extra features that I mentioned, like analog inputs and multiple actions per stroke. As I said, one of the most exciting things about switches like this are the numerous possibilities for features that you could never get with a regular board and switch. So it'd be great to see that here. Now moving back inside the board, my inquisitive electrical engineering brain got the better of me, and I wanted to understand how the Hall-Effect sensors actually worked. Namely, were they digital sensors, which would make the most sense, or were they analog and just output a variable voltage? Seeing as I couldn't actually find the sensors directly, I thought I would look up the two microcontrollers that are on the back. The one by the frankly brilliantly reinforced USB-C ports is an NSP1135U, a pretty standard ARM M0 microcontroller that does the USB interfacing. The other chip, marked as a GTRY52, I have no idea what it is. I can't find a datasheet, a manufacturer, a product listing on sites like Mouser, just nothing. Well, actually, if you Google that part number, one exact result returns. It's the exact part number, in fact. It's a Chinese language review of a keyboard called the ATK68, and it's literally the same board. It's an exact copy. It's the same keycaps, the same layout. Admittedly, I have the UK ISO layout, so it's slightly different, but it has the same setup otherwise. And looking at the picture of the USB-C port from inside really solidifies that it's the same board. Interestingly, the silkscreen in the article displays lists KG68U-GR as the model number, whereas this Endgame board has KB65U-GR. So it's a purpose-made board, just not wholly made by Endgame Gear. The date code is also nearly 3 months newer on the KB65, which is rather interesting. There is one very significant difference between the ATK68 and the KB65HE though, which helps justify the 150% price increase, which is that the ATK board has a plastic base, whereas the Endgame board has the beautifully machined billet alley block. That really does go a long way to making up for the price difference in sheer weight alone. Now, back to the board itself, it occurs to me that I haven't spoken much about what it's like to game on. The short answer is, it's fantastic. I set the trigger point to 10-10, making it a lot closer to being a hair trigger, making it feel super responsive and fast. The linear travel makes a lot of sense here, and feels great while gaming. It really does have a premium feel to it, something I enjoyed using a fair bit. My only fairly minor gripe is with just how tall of a profile the board is, and how little the sort of even the taller feet let you tilt the board upwards. I think with a wrist rest I'd be a lot more comfortable. The keycaps feel super premium too. They're double shot PBT with a nice slight roughness to them, which makes them the perfect amount of grippy yet easy to switch between. One final complaint I have is that while the FM key does give you access to an almost complete second layer of functions, including the ability to adjust the actuation point on the fly, you have to rely on, at the time of filming, a not super publicly available, it is available on the Overclockers UK product page, like PDF guide to know what to hit. The number keys acting as F keys makes sense, but the number pad or volume controls will be difficult to memorize when there's no cues on the boards itself. Most other cap sets include sub-printing or even hell ninja printing for those sorts of functions, so it'd be great if future boards could come with that. Equally, media controls more than just volume would be great too. I can't tell you how often I use the play pause button on my keyboard. It's kind of a must for me. In short then, while this is clearly a design Endgame bought in, they've picked an incredible platform to build on. The addition of the alley housing adds so much quality to the already premium design, which is just fantastic. The software does still leave something to be desired, both in terms of bugs and tweaks, and just outright features that I think would bring a lot of value to this board. Endgame were pretty responsive to my questions and bug reports prior to this review going out, so I'm incredibly hopeful that they can take what is already a pretty great board and elevate it to an incredible one. I should also note that the price tag, £139 at launch, is also pretty exceptional for a board this hefty. It genuinely matches the Keychron Q1 for both quality and heft, so for being £60 cheaper is excellent. All in, this is a great board with a lot of potential. As a proposition today, it still gets a great recommendation from me, and if knowing that it might be able to get better helps you justify that purchase even more, well then, that's great. If you happen to be interested in picking up a KB65HE, I'll leave a link to it in the description if you're interested. Otherwise, if you want to see more videos like this one, you can hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell notification icon, and check out plenty of other videos on the end cards. And equally, if you want to be able to test stuff like keyboards, mice, monitors, and other stuff, I make my own hardware called the open source testing tools, open source latency testing tool, and open source response time tool, available at osrtt.com. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. I'm still recovering from COVID, so apologies for sniffles and coughs and things you might hear. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you all in the next video.